I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. Today's guest is from the beautiful province of Alberta, depending on which part of the country you're in. And the weather there is just amazing and unusual for this time of year. One of the things that we're going to talk about today is community and what it's like to live in community where we all actually live in community. And so we'll get started on that. But first, I'm just going to ask him to introduce himself, a little bit of his past ministry journey, sort of how he's gotten to where he is. And we'll let you take it away, David.
Sure. Thanks, Ron. That's good to be with you. My name's Dave Bradford. I am the pastor at Brooks Alliance Church. I've been here for just over 12 years in this role. I actually was part of my ministry journey was I went to university in Ottawa, where I grew up, did my high school and university years. Went to Carleton University to do a commerce degree and get into the field of accounting, and God called me from that into youth ministry. So I went off to Canadian Bible College in Regina back in the day and did my degree there and met my wife there. And then we got married in 1998, and we've pastored in a few different places. We pastored in Trail, BC, in the Kootenays there for 3 years with the Trail Alliance Church, assistant pastor of youth and a few other things. And then we did 5+ years in High River, Alberta, just south of Calgary, pre-flood. So we're good with that.
Oh, you missed all that. Oh, that's too bad.
Well, yeah, we missed all the excitement, but I was pastor of youth and small groups there. Mm-hmm. And then we did a 2.5 years in Hamilton, Ontario, Paramount Drive Alliance Church.
Oh, yeah.
Again, yeah. Associate youth and other things. And then we've been here since January 2011.
And you serve as a solo pastor there, or are you?
It has been for the bulk of it. Mm-hmm. We have a young couple working with us now. They're involved in the Alliance, the foreign missions track with the Alliance. So they're here for roughly 3 years, and then they're hoping to, the plan is to be deployed overseas. So yeah, they're doing some fun things with us here.
Now, isn't that a great way to go, is to have students or people that have just come out of school, and then they're with you, and then they take off and head out into outreach and into a new community all over the world, I guess. Yeah. Have they an indication or a sense of where they might be heading?
Well, a very unique situation in the sense that she's from Brooks, went to Ambrose in Calgary, went to Mexico as an apprentice worker with the Alliance for essentially 2-year contracts. And over the course of 8 years down there, met a wonderful Mexican guy, got married, they had a kid. And so it was more just the reality that they needed to, come back, get a few things sorted out in Canada.
Yeah.
And then, so the plan is for them to go back to Mexico. That's their hope.
Oh, wow. So when we talk about community outreach for them, I mean, they're coming from, I guess you'd call it a very different culture. How are they seeing? Sorry, we're getting off on an interesting track here, which I don't think I had set. But how are they seeing community outreach in a North American, Canadian setting versus even a Mexican setting and that type of thing?
Oh, well, I mean, there's obviously a number of cultural differences. I think pace is different, and the pace in Canada isn't always necessarily good.
Yeah, that's true.
I think one of the things that they're passionate about was they were in they lived in Mexico City, but went out into very rural, isolated, impoverished, and I think some Indigenous communities. So that's a significant piece of what God's put in their heart. One of the unique pieces in Brooks, in our community, I mean, it's becoming more like this across Canada, but one of the unique pieces here is the diversity. And they have a huge heart for what we would call new Canadians or newcomers to Canada, right? We have an enormous meatpacking plant here. And so right. So we have that nickname, the city of 100 hellos, because there's such diversity here. right? So they have a huge heart for people that are newer to our community, kind of thing, different ethnicities, right? We
Yeah.
as a side story, we had a Ukrainian family that we were helping before Christmas, and so the long story, but she's from Ukraine and he's from Peru, and so they speak Spanish. So our associate, he speaks Spanish, being Mexican, and so we were having a meeting one day, and they were going back and forth with him, and then he turned to me and he started talking to me, but he was talking in Spanish, and I said, well, like I
Time
don't
out.
understand
Yeah.
Spanish. He's like, I've got so many languages going on in my head. So we had a good laugh about that, but they're doing a great job, connecting in that way.
I suppose in one way, reaching into the community is knowing the community. How have you gone about that, understanding the context and the people and that type of thing in the community?
I think part of it is just it's been a learning experience, right? So um yeah, I mean, I think some of the people who were here long before me knew some of these things already. And I would not profess to be even remotely an expert in any of this, but I think one of the things, for me, even early on, I was like, why can't we worship together? And but the reality of the heart language is, your own being able to worship in your own language is really important. So there's tons of ethnic churches in our community, right? There's lots of, there's lots of different language expressions of faith here, right? There's a mosque here. There's a good size,
Yeah.
Muslim community here as well. So it's just knowing it and understanding a little bit, right? And people's backgrounds.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that once you get involved in the community, what what have been the adjustments that you've had to make in order to reach into the community, to be able to welcome people and that type of thing? I'm I'm referring to a previous podcast that I had done with Kevin Driver,
Okay.
and just knowing some of, even in Banff where he is from, the very broad diversity. And how do you get involved in the community?
Oh boy, wow. I mean, you
Well,
got to
that's a
get out.
big question. Okay.
That's a big question. Yeah. I mean, you got to get out, right? And I think part of the thing is that it's one thing to say the church, but
Right.
the church, I mean, it's a Sunday school answer, but the church is the people, right? And so your people are out, our people are out throughout our community, rubbing shoulders with people all the time. And there's people that are far from God in all sorts of different walks of life. And we've got a couple of people that are in our church family. They teach at a federal government sponsored English learning center, right? So that's part of these newcomers coming to Canada. They have to learn English, and so they rub shoulders all the time with people that are very, very fresh and new
Yeah.
into our country, our community. That I think it's getting out there, right? And the ripple effects of it, are all through our community.
Okay. So how do you get out there? How do you encourage people to do that?
I think it's just affirming that they are already out there,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we've got a handful of teachers in our church family. They are rubbing shoulders every day with people, right? So I think that one of the things we've been guilty of is, we want to create programs
Yeah.
to somehow, without sounding too controversial, to justify why we're here. But we don't need to start programs. We need to see what God is doing and join Him there. Like it's so. Just affirming that people are already out there and they've already got all sorts of contacts. You don't need to artificially create them. They're there already. Everybody's got a neighbor. Jesus told us to love our neighbors. We can try and ask for try to split hairs on who is my neighbor. Well, look across the road and look next door. We've all got neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
I mean, you've described very well one of the very important attitudes that a church needs to have. Are there any other attitudes that you see are needed in a church to sort of say, okay, we'll be effective community partners, we'll work in the community? That's a big question. Let's see where you go with it.
I would say there's a handful. I would say humility. Like we don't have all the answers, right? There are one of the things I think we're guilty of doing is we have to start something ourselves. So instead of looking at what's already happening in our community and saying, hey, can we come and join you? And you sprinkle in 2 or 3 or 4 people who love Jesus around a table or a group.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we have to start our own thing? Right. So there's a humility in that, people might be doing it better than we are doing it, or we could do it. We don't have all the answers. So let's go learn from other people. I think there's definitely an attitude of servanthood, right? Jesus called us to serve. So, a question that I often use is what do you need from me, or what do you need from us? Like what? And so it doesn't mean we can meet the need, but we can ask, right? And if we can. So I think humility, I think servanthood, I think definitely one is generosity.
Yeah.
Like, my particular context here, this is one of the most generous, well, this is the most generous church I've ever been a part of in my life.
Yeah.
And it's so much fun to be able to, we're blessed to be a blessing, right? 2 Corinthians talks about you'll be made rich in every way so that you can be generous, which leads to people giving glory to God. And so that's an active mission, right? Where, so I think the generosity piece, and that's, in smaller churches, that's not always the case.
Yeah. Most often it's, we got to survive instead of giving away. We're pulling in. Yeah.
Right. I think another, I don't know if you'd call it attitude, but something we've tried to work at here is just perspective, right? You hear people saying, oh, let's go change the world. And then, you sit around a group like that and you're just like, I'm too tired and it's too big and it's too hard. And so, right. So you don't even do anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for us, we've tried to have this idea where, you can't change the world, but with God's guidance and his partnership and his leading, you can change a piece of the world. So, right, instead of being a mile wide and an inch deep, we'd rather say no to a bunch of things so that we can be narrow focused. It's like the concept of a laser beam, right? Your everyday light bulb, and I'm not a physicist or whatever, but your everyday light bulb isn't doing a lot of damage, right? But you get the right laser, you can cut through thick steel, right? Because of the focus, right? And so I think so I don't know if that's so much an attitude or a perspective, where you just say, we don't have to do everything. It is okay to say no so that we can continue to say yes with all of our might, kind of thing, right? Does that make sense?
It does. I part of me goes back to the last few years dealing with both pandemic and polarity and many other aspects. How are you finding that perspective that you don't have to do anything? Is that part of coming through this well?
It's that's been tricky because you get 10 people in a room, you get 10 different opinions on what
Really?
should be
11 maybe.
Yeah, you're probably right. You've done that rodeo, right?
Yeah.
I think that we just tried to be really sensitive to not push past comfort zones, right? Like, so in other words, if you don't feel comfortable because of said restrictions or said conditions or whatever, then we're not going to ask you to or push you outside of that. I think part of the thing, again, going back to just maybe the more organic nature of things, is we all have neighbors. I mean, you might live on a ranch, 30 minutes out of town, or you might live on a farm 15 minutes out of town, but likely that's where you've grown up. So your neighbors still, right? So we've all got neighbors, and we can check in on them. And even through that whole thing, we can just love our neighbors. It doesn't have to be like crazy complicated.
Okay, I'm going to ask the big question here. Why bother trying to be a part of the community as a church?
Well, I think there's a handful of reasons, I think. I mean, we could talk for a while on that, but I think there's a handful of reasons. One is there's people like, I've said so many times that, like, our church has lots of empty chairs, and we could fill it 100 times over with people who are far from God. in this community and not run out of people who are far from God.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one reason. I've referenced it again, just some of the teachings of Jesus were love God and love people,
Yeah.
right? He boils everything down to those two commands. And he said, love your neighbor, right? So there's all sorts of that stuff. Like, I think, not to quote too much from the message, but I like the way I wrote it down, just the way John chapter 1, verse 14 is worded. The word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood, right? Where just Jesus did that,
Yeah,
right?
very much so.
And so we need to be in the neighborhood. I also think too that Jeremiah 29 is important. This is the kind of the word to the exiles, and this is what God says: build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And I think that the fact is, the majority of us that would probably be, thinking about this stuff from a church context, we believe in the sovereignty of God. We're here. God has us here for a reason, and we need to, sort of seek out the prosperity of the community that we live in. It needs to be better because we're here as followers of Jesus.
Okay, so let's jump right in there and ask the question. So in Brooks, Alberta, what is the peace and prosperity that your city needs?
Oh, well, at the end of the day, I think the Sunday school answer is, people need Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
They do. But I think the more I think to take that a little bit deeper is, 2 Corinthians talks about us being the fragrance, like the aroma of Christ and the light of Christ and ambassadors of Christ. And I think that's, again, that getting outside the four walls, right? Being in places, taking the presence of Jesus into places that those places or those people may not necessarily come to a church gathering, right? And I think I really think that's part of it. And I mean, I'm not a really big futurist, or I don't really study, sociology and stuff like that. But I think that as we're moving into a time at least in our culture, where it would seem to me like there's a mass rejection of God. I know God is still doing things and he's still working in the lives of people, but we need the presence of Jesus more and more in places that are getting darker and darker.
I've just finished reading Bruce Clemenger's book called The New Orthodoxy on Canada's new civil religion. Okay. And you're hitting right on the head with that idea that we live in a country that sees less of God, even though God may be in very active ways working. And how do we bring that into the life of our community and to help them see God?
Right. And I think that less of that is going to be formal programs, because we're going to butt up against sort of policies or procedures or rules that are going to say you can't do that, right? Like as simple as, you can't have a prayer group in a school, or I'm not saying that's the case here, but you can't, all the things you can't do. You know what? I can still go and move about my community. I can still interact with people, and the presence of Christ is with me, right? Right. His Spirit is with me. And I think in smaller churches and smaller communities, when you think of, I think of all the churches in this community that are filled with people who love Jesus, and he's filled them with his Spirit. And those people move about throughout the day, throughout week to week, going into all sorts of places, businesses, places of work, their kids' schools, community organizations, all that stuff, right? And as we take the presence of Christ there, it would be no different than serving overseas in a very non-Christian context. Well, you're not going to start programs. You're going to hope that by rubbing shoulders, they're going to see the person of Jesus in you and ask for more.
Mm-hmm. Before we head to the end of this, I'm going to ask maybe one final question that you can go on and on about, but I'll say, if you had one piece of advice that you were to give to a small church leader, they're looking to work within the community, to be a presence within the community. What would that be? And your one piece of advice can have 57 subsections, but yes, however you want to go at
it. Well, I think two things sort of come to mind. So I'll maybe, instead of 57 subpoints. So the first one, I think, I really do think, not to overstate the obviousnness of it, is pray and ask the Lord for guidance. And that sounds, sort of like the pat answer, but really, if God asks you to do something, doesn't matter how big it is or how difficult it is or how ridiculous it is, roll up your sleeves and get to work, right? And trust him to do the impossible. I mean, I think that's probably the biggest piece, is just, I'm not sure if you've done the Experiencing God stuff with the Blackabees, but find where God's working and join him there, right? Sometimes we try to make it up ourselves, and he's already doing things. So I think that's a big piece of advice I would give. I think the second piece of advice is just maybe a more practical one, and it goes back to that. Don't be a mile wide and an inch deep. Focus in on something. We can't change the world. And if you stand up at the front, if you're a pastor on a Sunday morning, and say, we're going to change the world for Jesus, and people are like, oh, that's too big. Like, we can't do that.
Yeah.
And the reality is you can't, but you can change a piece of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And some of that comes back to our experience with sort of global missions in our context, right? The Alliance is big into global missions, and we said, to the detriment of other sort of partnerships, we're going to focus in on one area. And so we've had a partnership for over 10 years now with some people in Costa Rica, and they're doing a wonderful work, and the kingdom of God is growing there. But we have been able to partner with them to the exclusion of others. But I don't think anybody in our church family would say that we haven't changed the world there, that piece of the world. With right. God's partnership, in partnership with those people on the ground, we've changed the world for God's glory. Well, it's the same thing in our local community, right? You can't meet every need. So, prayerfully find a place and dig in and drill down and build relationships and be humble, learn, serve, be generous, right? Generosity for me is a reap sow thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Start being generous, and you'll see stuff come in, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just ask then, off that question and sort of what you've said. Could you, in a general way, just tell a story about one of those people within your congregation that you would say, they focus, they've sort of taken that area that they can work in the community and that they're working in. If you can give me an example of that.
Well, I probably could give you a few. I think that one that jumps to mind is, and he probably wouldn't view it this way, but one of our teachers. Mm-hmm. He runs a tremendous band program in town. And so, the music program is part of the school system, but on the side, he has a community band association that sort of oversees a lot of their activities that are extracurricular, band trips, things like that, performances. And he has, I always encourage him. He's got a tremendous influence with these kids. They love him, right? They do. They love him. And I watch, like, my kids have gone through it, all four of my kids. And I always try to encourage them, like, you're making a difference in the lives of these kids. Don't ever underestimate that. Right. And, it might not be as blatant as them coming to faith in Jesus, but hopefully they see Christ in him as he goes about his business. So, I mean, that would be, I think, one example that would jump to my mind.
That's a great illustration, because I mean, I'm a bit of a music guy myself, and I love music, and
you got a wonderful voice.
Well, thank you. But I think we don't realize how much that can change in a young person's or another person that you're connecting with. And that I think your points about community being, just be in the community, love your neighbor. great stuff. So anyways, our time has come to an end, unfortunately, way too quick.
Serious. That went fast. Yeah.
Yes, it sure went way too
Maybe,
fast.
maybe not for the listener, but who
Well,
knows?
okay, we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, so thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.